All right, so today we're going to continue through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, which that is roughly from the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the end of chapter 25. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. This is one of the easier sections of Matthew to entitle because, after all, that's pretty much all Jesus does here in this phase of his ministry, these last few days of his ministry, actually. And I'm now leading you through the fourth portion of section 6, which is Matthew 23. All of Matthew 23 and only Matthew 23, so very easy for outlining purposes. And I've titled this portion, The Heirs of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation. So among the leaders of Israel, we're talking about the scribes and Pharisees in particular as the heirs of Moses, and we're talking about the way that they have played their part in guiding the people into this judgment that Jesus is talking about off and on throughout this section. And of course, this portion is composed of 3 distinct warnings given by Jesus, all pertaining to the scribes and the Pharisees. So we've outlined it in terms of these 3 different warnings, one of them being much longer than the other, and that's where we are now. We're in the second of these 3 warnings, and this is the one where he turns directly to the scribes and the Pharisees themselves and addresses them specifically and directly. So today we're continuing that discussion, and we're talking about woes number 5 and 6. He gives these list of woes against the scribes and the Pharisees, and we're on numbers 5 and 6 together this morning. Now, before I read the passage, I have something to show you. I have here a cup, and I was wondering if any of you, especially you younger people maybe, if you want to think about this, if any of you would like to have a drink of water from this particular cup. Anyone? I see, here's some snickering out there. What is wrong with my cup, Esther, that you're snickering there, if that's you?
It looks disgusting.
It's disgusting. I got this out of my cabinet. You're saying it looks disgusting? What's wrong with it?
It looks like there's dirt inside.
There's dirt in. Okay. Well, I guess the answer to that is to clean it off before using it, right? You're going to clean this off. So, washcloth. I do have some water. So let's see if we can improve the plight of this cup here a little bit. All right. Let's wash it off. All right. Okay, all better, right? Right?
No.
It's not. Well, what's wrong with it now? All right. Dirty on the inside. You mean you wouldn't want to drink from a cup of water like this?
No.
All that dirt in there?
How thirsty am I?
Okay, there's another way to address the issue. How thirsty am I? Well, yes, of course, as you can see, the cup is dirty. It's dirty on the inside in particular. Cleaning the outside didn't do much good. And if there's any part of the cup you want to clean, it's the inside before you actually use it. By the way, I did not get that directly out of my cabinet. I did dirty it myself as a sermon illustration. My cups are clean in my cabinet, I promise you that. But we've got this dirty cup here, and this is actually the image that Jesus presents to us in one of these woes that he addresses to the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, according to Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees, they think they can make themselves look good on the outside while doing nothing about their sins. That's the issue Jesus sees with them in both of these woes, actually, that we're going to read. And according to Jesus, that's like cleaning the outside of the cup without cleaning its inside and thinking it's all better just because you washed the outside of it, even though the inside is still dirty. So let's read this. This is Matthew 23, verses 25 through 28. Where Jesus says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." So there's one woe. Here's another one. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, the title for my sermon today is Secret Pollution. Now, pollution is something which is harmful or poisonous, and whether you think of things in the air or in the water, something that will cause harm to you when you come in contact with it. And according to Jesus in these two woes I just read, the blindness and the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees were a secret pollution for the Jewish people. They are something that causes uncleanness, to use the term used by Jesus. And it's the secret pollution because very few people noticed it. If you were like Jesus or someone following Jesus who listened to him, you would know these things. But by and large, this is the kind of pollution that spreads without anyone knowing about it. That's who the scribes and the Pharisees really were in Israel at that time. Now, my outline for this sermon has 3 headings, and I will give those to you so you can follow my sermon a little better as I go through it. The 5th woe, this is the first heading, the 5th woe condemned the scribes and Pharisees for blindly seeking undeserved honor. And you might find that a strange way to summarize that teaching about the dirty cup, but I will get around to explaining why I put it that way, that they were blindly seeking undeserved honor. And then, second heading, about the 6th woe. The 6th woe condemned the scribes and Pharisees for destructive hypocrisy. So not just hypocrisy, but a hypocrisy that had an effect on other people, a destructive effect. And then final heading for today, throughout these 2 woes together, Jesus described men who craved the honor of their people more than the law of their God, which of course is a huge problem for someone who claims to sit in the chair of Moses, as these scribes and these Pharisees would have said about themselves. Now, in recording these woes for us, Matthew is still laboring to evangelize and disciple the Jews of Israel, which is his goal for this entire gospel. It is a very Jewish gospel. We kind of deduce from the evidence in the gospel that he's writing it to Jews there in the land of the Jews and trying to evangelize them or disciple the ones who are already Christians. And these 2 woes are certainly very Jewish in their tone, which I think will become evident as I talk about them. We are once again going to be delving into the laws of uncleanliness and cleansing things and all those sorts of matters which are familiar to anyone who has read the law of Moses. So very Jewish in their tone. However, these ideas presented in these woes really are timeless. They're unbound by place or culture to the point where I can hold up a dirty cup to you, here and now, and you get the idea of what Jesus is talking about. So as we study these men, let's also study ourselves for any similarities, and let's try to take watch over our own souls and our own lives to avoid the blindness and the hypocrisy of these men. So let's begin with heading number 1, which is again about the 5th woe. The 5th woe condemned the scribes and the Pharisees for blindly seeking undeserved honor. So let's read this woe again to make sure it is fresh in our minds. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." Now this woe was apparently based on the practices of the scribes and the Pharisees regarding the ceremonial cleanliness of vessels. And by vessels, I mean not just cups, but things like pots and pans and spoons and forks and these kinds of things, these kinds of vessels. And I say that it's apparently based on their rules about those things, just based on taking what I know about them and what Jesus says here and putting it all together. Now let's start with the law of Moses itself. According to the law of Moses, a vessel, like a cup or a pot or a pan or something like that, could become unclean. So it's not just people that become unclean in this ritual sense that Moses is talking about, it's also objects like cups. Now I have an example for you from the book of Leviticus, chapter 15, where you don't necessarily need to turn, but I do want to read this just to give you an example of this kind of uncleanliness that shows up in the law of Moses. This is from the section about bodily discharges, which is as gross as it sounds, but one of these things he had to deal with, right? Leviticus 15, verse 12, simply says this, however, an earthenware vessel, think like a clay pot or something like that, an earthenware vessel which the person with the discharge touches shall be broken, and every wooden vessel shall be rinsed in water. So here's this person made unclean by some kind of bodily fluid or whatever. Whatever they touch also becomes unclean, including things like cups or vessels or whatever. And if it's a wooden one, you got to rinse that off. If it's an earthenware one, you got to break it because you can't use it anymore. It's irreparably unclean. You can't wash that. The wooden stuff you can wash if you need to. So that's just an example here of this kind of thing you see in the law of Moses, just the basic idea that these vessels can become unclean, and you have to deal with that in some way. Now, as for the scribes and the Pharisees, they developed far more detailed ideas about how to cleanse these vessels. Moses just says, if it's a clay pot, break it. If it's wooden, rinse it off. He doesn't give you a lot of detail. But the scribes and the Pharisees went to great extremes to elaborate on these things, much like they often did. If you're wondering how detailed they became on this point, let me tell you about how this topic is addressed in the Mishnah. And again, the Mishnah is the written form of these oral traditions of the elders that you see the scribes and the Pharisees talking about. Eventually they became written down. Now the Mishnah is written down divided into these tractates, as they call them. So basically the portions of the Mishnah. I don't know why they're called tractates, but they are. That's just what they're called. Now the longest tractate, the longest portion of the Mishnah is actually dedicated to dealing with unclean vessels like cups and pots and utensils and things like that. So how much detail did they spend on this? A lot. It's actually the longest portion of the written form of their traditions that they developed. So yeah, they spent a lot of time on this issue of these unclean vessels and how to clean them and all those kinds of things. Furthermore, it might interest you to know, based on the passage we're talking about, that the rabbis actually made a distinction between the inside and the outside of all vessels and implements. They even did this for things that you wouldn't normally think of as having an inside or an outside, like a fork. In their perspective, a fork has an inside and an outside. Just for some reason, they want to apply that concept to a lot of things and not just cups and pots and pans. So they have this idea of the inside and the outside of the vessel. And furthermore, here's another interesting point. They had rules and traditions about whether you had to wash one side if the other side got unclean, to use the actual Mosaic term. So there might be situations where the inside gets unclean, but you don't have to clean the outside, just the inside, or vice versa. So they have all these rules about vessels and how to clean them. They've got rules about what's the inside, what's the outside. They've got rules about how to cleanse the inside and the outside. They have a lot of detail on all of this. And that is actually why I say that this fifth woe given by Jesus was apparently based on the practices of the scribes and the Pharisees regarding this cleanliness of vessels. When he starts talking about the cup and it's unclean and the inside and the outside of it, he's taking language from some of these rabbinic discussions. And he's just applying it, though, not to the actual cups and the pots and the pans and the forks and the spoons, but to the men themselves, to the scribes and the Pharisees who are so concerned about these things. So it seems like he's basing this criticism of them off of the language of some of their practices. Now, according to Christ, these practices about vessels and how to clean them were a great illustration for the blindness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So when he sees these men in their spiritual blindness, the analogy he thinks of for that is how they go about their own practices for the cleansing of cups and things of that nature. Jesus accused the scribes and the Pharisees of only cleaning the outside of the cup. All right? And of course, he's referring to them in particular. The cup is an analogy for who they are. And we have to ask what he means by that specifically. What does he mean when he tells them, you guys only clean the outside of the cup? Well, most likely, Jesus finds fault with the scribes and the Pharisees for seeking honor by appearing righteous. They put forth this appearance of righteousness, and in doing so, they're trying to get the honor of other people They want other people to think of them as righteous, and that's what they're doing, and that's what Jesus means by, you guys only clean the outside of the cup. And I'm basing this off the criticisms that Jesus has already made of these men. If we turn back to an earlier portion of Matthew 23, we see what his lead criticism of these men actually is. If you go to Matthew 23, verses 5 through 7, he says this to them, or rather about them. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. So the scribes and the Pharisees did all of their deeds to be noticed by men. They are totally concerned with getting respect from other people for the things that they do. And that, I think, is what Jesus meant by accusing them of cleaning the outside of the cup. Here they are trying to put forth this presentation, this appearance of being a clean cup, whether they are or not. They're wanting to create the appearance of being a clean cup so that people think well of them. All right, so that seems to be what Jesus is doing in this particular woe. And another reason I say that is because it matches the next woe that Jesus gives, which I'm sure you realize is very similar. Let's read that one again. Going on here in Matthew 23, in verse 29, he says, verse 27, excuse me. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too, outwardly, appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Okay, so the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to appear righteous so that other people would think of them and their lives as being these beautiful things, right? That's what they want to do, so that's why they take the concerns they take. Now, in this concern for honor among men, the scribes and the Pharisees showed their blindness. They showed that they do not see what really matters with regard to God's requirements and God's kingdom. Those men turn a blind eye to their actual sin, thinking that the appearance of righteousness was more important than the reality. That's the kind of thing that these men would never say, but it is how they live. It is what they do. And it shows the blindness that is there at the root of their character. And so Christ makes use of these practices they have about vessels and the cleanliness of those vessels as an illustration for their blindness about how they run their own lives. They spend their time cleaning themselves on the outside to appear righteous, regardless of what the reality is about them. Now, Christ also used these practices to teach about gaining honor through genuine righteousness. It's not just a criticism. He actually gives them a clue for what they should have been doing all along. And you see that in verse 26, where he says, "You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." All right, so he gives this, what would have been the solution for their problem, how to not be blind with regard to these things. It is kind of difficult to understand. It kind of makes you scratch your head. First, clean the inside of the cup so that the outside might also be clean. Well, we got to work with this and try to find a way to understand it. And however we understand it, both parts of the exhortation need to make sense. So first, the part about the need to clean the inside of the cup, but also how that results in the outside being automatically cleaned as well. Because normally, cleaning a cup or a vessel doesn't work that way. If I clean the inside of this like I should, I still have to clean the outside eventually, right? It's not like the cleanliness bleeds through the plastic, to clean all the rest of it. An actual literal cup doesn't work that way. But Jesus says with regard to a person's life, cleaning the inside results in the outside being clean as well. So we've got to make sense of this. Now, the first part of this is easiest to explain. Cleaning the inside of the cup. It would refer to a genuine righteousness, not just the appearance of it, but the actual true righteousness that a person ought to have. If the inside of the cup is full of robbery and self-indulgence, then cleaning the inside means repenting of those things, or whatever your sins might be. It might not be robbery and self-indulgence, but whatever your sins are, cleanse yourself of those things, and that's what it means to clean the inside of your cup. your life. Now let's ask, what would be the result of this repentance? If you actually did that, if you actually repented of those things, what would happen? Well, the result would be a righteous life, which is in fact honorable, at least among the people who honor righteousness. We admit that not everyone does. Plenty of wicked people only give honor to wickedness. But among people who actually honor those who live a righteous life, you would automatically be honored in that way. Because if you're actually cleansing yourself from the inside and truly repenting, that is going to show itself in how you live. People are going to see that, and you are going to have their respect. So that would be the actual result of a genuine repentance. And in this way, I think the scribes and the Pharisees could have gained the honor they wanted. They wanted this notoriety among men. They wanted to be thought of as being righteous. And they could have gotten there if they had pursued the real form of righteousness, if they had actually repented, rather than just pursuing the appearance of righteousness as a kind of shortcut. They would have cleaned the inside of their cups, and they would have automatically been clean on the outside as well. They would have had the honor resulting from a genuine repentance. And in this way, I think Jesus uses the image of this cup not just to condemn these men, but also to teach what they should have done and what we should do in response to these things, actually repenting, having the true form of righteousness, and thus being clean both on the inside and on the outside automatically. But since the scribes and the Pharisees were not genuinely righteous, Jesus condemned them for blindly seeking undeserved honor. And now you see why it is undeserved, because they don't have the reality. It's all a sham. It's all fake. And that is what Jesus is trying to convey in this fifth woe here in Matthew 23. And that takes us a third of the way through the message. We come now to my second heading, which is on the next woe, woe number 6. And this sixth woe condemned the scribes and the Pharisees for destructive hypocrisy. So here we come back to the familiar theme of these men being hypocrites, but this time we want to talk about the destructiveness of their hypocrisy. Now this woe, with its references to whitewashed tombs and those kinds of things, this woe is also likely based on the practices of the scribes and the Pharisees, this time regarding burial places, tombs and graves and things like that. Now, English translations of this particular woe often use the word tomb. It says, you are like whitewashed tombs. Now, a tomb, usually we think of a structure, maybe a cave that was already there, but maybe also a stone structure that was built where you entomb a dead body, where you put a person's remains after they die. However, the word used by Matthew, the Greek word taphos, is actually broad enough to refer to any burial place. So it's not just tombs. It could just be an ordinary grave, like a hole you dig in the ground where you lay a person's remains. Could be any of those kinds of things. So it's actually a broader term than just tomb. And they can't say all of that in an English translation, so they pick the best word they can. But just keep in mind, the word is broader than just a tomb. It can refer to graves as well, any burial place. All right, now among the Jews, burial places needed some special care since they could cause uncleanness. Yet again, we come to this idea of things being made unclean based on just the idea that God has of these things. And I admit it's a bit mysterious in the law of Moses, certainly not the way we think about things, but it is there. I want to read to you this portion from Numbers, just one verse again, you don't have to go there, but I do want to read this to you. Numbers 19, verse 16, where we see reference made to this idea of uncleanness coming from a tomb or a burial place. Says this, and it says, also anyone who is in the open field, who touches one who has been slain with a sword, or who has died naturally, or a human bone, or a grave, shall be unclean for 7 days. So if you come into contact with a dead body, or with one of these burial places encasing one of these dead bodies, you become unclean for 7 days. No. Yeah, it's pretty bad, right? You become unclean for 7 days. So we see from this law that touching a grave would make you unclean for a pretty long period of time. Now, for that reason, the Jews would often mark graves with some kinds of white substance like chalk or lime, something to make this grave nice and bright so it'll stand out, so it'll be easily seen, so that nobody accidentally touches it and becomes unclean. That's not commanded in the law of Moses. That's just something that Jews did later on in their history based on what the law of Moses was saying. They would whitewash these tombs and these burial places. We actually see, once again, in the Mishnah, the written form of these oral traditions, we see rabbis making reference to this practice and how to do it and things like that. Furthermore, also mentioned in the Mishnah, we see some special precautions taken for graves in the month leading up to Passover. Because in Passover, this is a time, one of these great festivals of the Jews, when all kinds of people are coming into Jerusalem from all over the country. So you've got all these travelers coming in. And since these travelers were unfamiliar with the area and didn't know where everyone was buried and all those kinds of things, some special precautions were taken at that time. The people of Jerusalem would actually go out into the surrounding countryside and re-whitewash a lot of these tombs and these graves to make sure they were nice and bright, very conspicuous, so that no traveler would come through and accidentally step on a grave or lean his hand up against a tomb or whatever, not knowing what it was, and become defiled for the Passover, which you become defiled before the Passover, you can't participate in the Passover, which is a problem if you're a practicing devout Jew. So you have all these special practices here taking place and really being redoubled in the time of the Passover. Incidentally, when Jesus is teaching these things here in Jerusalem at the end of his life, it's at the occasion of the Passover. So these kinds of things would have been pretty fresh on people's minds. As all these crowds are coming into Jerusalem, they're going to be looking for these whitewashed tombs and these graves to make sure they don't accidentally step on them. Right? So it's all very much fresh on everyone's mind at this point. Now, according to Christ, these practices with burial places were once again a great illustration for the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. He again takes this Jewish practice that was very common and uses it as a way of talking about the scribes and the Pharisees themselves. All around Jerusalem, you would see these bright white tombs and graves shining in the sun because they've been recently whitewashed. They're nice and bright, very easy to see. But regardless of how nice they look, on the inside, those graves are full of rotting flesh and bare bones and all the uncleanness of death. This nice, beautiful tomb or grave that you see there shining in the sun actually conveys uncleanness and will defile you if you touch it. Well, in the same way, anyone in Jerusalem would see the foremost scribes of the entire nation and their Pharisee devotees. They'd see these men and think, these are the most knowledgeable, these are the most holy men among us, the scribes and the Pharisees. But all of that was a bold lie to cover the deep rot in the hearts of those men. They were like whitewashed tombs. They were worse than whitewashed tombs, in fact. They were this source of uncleanness that was covered up to look nice and pretty, but really was still a source of uncleanness. Now, these scribes and the Pharisees, when you think about it, think about who these men are. These are the men who have been waiting years for the opportunity to destroy an innocent man, Jesus, due to nothing more than envy and their own wounded pride. Because his ministry and the things he was saying, cast them in a bad light and robbed them of the honor they're so much trying to create for themselves. Because of that, they want this man dead. And they're coming very close to their opportunity to do that. Just a few days after the delivery of these woes, these men will see their opportunity and finally take it. And Jesus will be dead in a tomb of his own at that time. Not for long, but he will be dead in a tomb of his own because of these men like these men, the scribes and the Pharisees. They are truly full of death, and their mouths really are open graves, aren't they? The analogy of death here is not very far off the mark based on what these men are planning for Jesus all this time. But all the while, they whitewash themselves as men worthy of high honors for their insight into the ways of God and for their obedience to his law. They make themselves look pretty good, and they take a lot of effort to create that illusion. But that's all it is. It is an illusion. And for that reason, Christ made use of these burial places as an illustration for their hypocrisy. You say a hypocrite is someone that wears a mask, someone who's playing a part like an actor. Well, now we can change the analogy These men are like whitewashed tombs. Christ also accused the scribes and the Pharisees of spreading an especially powerful kind of uncleanness. This is also related to them being a tomb, of them being a grave. Now, several minutes ago, I read to you from Numbers 19, which said that contact with a dead body or a grave would result in you being unclean for 7 days. And when you think about the inconvenience of that, it is pretty inconvenient because for 7 days you got to be careful of what you touch so that you don't make anything else unclean or anyone else unclean because of your uncleanness. And the thing is, not only is that inconvenient, but it is especially inconvenient because in the law of Moses, there's not much that'll make you unclean for that duration of time. For the most part, if you become unclean, according to the law of Moses, you're unclean for 1 day. That's pretty much the general rule. If something makes you unclean, that uncleanness only lasts for 1 day. You have to wash yourself, but after that, in 24 hours' time, you're going to be regarded as clean again. But not so if you touch a grave or a dead body. You're going to be unclean 7 days. And really, there's not a whole lot else in the law of Moses that'll make you unclean for that long. I have found one other source of uncleanness that'll make you unclean for 7 days. And I found only one thing that makes you unclean for longer. As it happens, giving birth makes you unclean for much longer than that, like 40 days or so, maybe even 80 days, depending on the child. So you've got worse forms of uncleanness, but not many. I mean, touching a dead body or touching a grave makes you unclean for a relatively long time based on the law of Moses. So this is a very powerful kind of uncleanness, just thinking about this. So therefore, thinking about this and applying it to the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus is accusing them of spreading a very powerful kind of uncleanness. They don't just make people unclean. They make people unclean for a long time, comparatively speaking. So just as the shining whitewash on those graves and tombs was actually a sign of spiritual danger, even so, Christ wants us to view all pretensions of righteousness as a powerful pollution. When you see these kinds of people that put forth this great effort into this appearance of righteousness, you're supposed to respond to that by thinking, but that is a source of danger for me. If I come into contact with that person, I could become unclean for a very long time. That's what Christ wants you to think of when you think of these scribes and these Pharisees or anyone like them, anyone that puts forth this effort to appear righteous without actually being righteous. And that is why I call this a destructive hypocrisy. It's not just that the scribes and the Pharisees are hypocrites. It's that their hypocrisy has an effect on other people. It makes other people unclean in this way, just like a whitewashed tomb, which is the message of this sixth woe here in Matthew 23. Okay, so now that I've discussed both of these woes separately, I want to make a general comment about both of them together. This is my final heading for this sermon. So we're moving toward the end game right now. In this final heading, my effort is to explain some of the other specific accusations in these two woes, some of the words especially that Christ uses as he talks about these scribes and these Pharisees. Just as I've already said, Jesus described these men, he describes these men as men who crave honor more than the law of their God. What I want to do is I want to fill in the details of that using some of the details that Christ himself has given in these woes. Now, the first of these specific accusations, at least in my own list of them, is that the scribes and Pharisees were inwardly full of lawlessness. Okay, this is one of the words that Christ uses, lawlessness. This one is found in the sixth woe. You can see it here in verse 28, where he says, "So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." So there is the word that he uses against them at this point. Inwardly, they are full of lawlessness. Now, with this accusation of lawlessness, Jesus merely summarizes much of what he has said so far in Matthew 23, that these men are lawless men. Christ said that the scribes and the Pharisees place the burden of law-keeping on the people, while they themselves will not move those burdens with so much as a finger. That's what Jesus said about them toward the very beginning of all this when he was warning the crowds and his disciples about these men. They won't even touch the burdens of the law with their little finger, which seems like a form of lawlessness. Make everyone else do the heavy lifting while I don't do anything at all. Right? So lawlessness in that regard. Christ has also indicated that their methods and judgments regarding oaths and oath breaking display a disregard for oath keeping and even for God himself. We saw that most recently in the third woe, where he talks about the problems with them and what they say about oaths. I mean, here they are. It's a very simple thing from the law of Moses. When you swear an oath, keep your word. Well, they come in and say, well, you don't have to. If you word it this particular way, it doesn't matter. So a pretty great disregard for something very fundamentally easy about the law of Moses. Finally, he has most recently accused these men of neglecting the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These are the things that Christ said characterize the law as a whole, but these men, the scribes and the Pharisees, they don't really bother with that. They're content to sit there and make rules about how to tithe properly, and that's all the work they're going to do. So in all of this, in all what Christ has said, just kind of hitting the high points of what he has said so far, the accusation of lawlessness seems pretty natural. Even though these men are, in effect, the heirs of Moses, they sit in the chair of Moses, they represent the law of Moses in some degree, but they frankly don't represent that law very well, because these men, when you really get down to it, these are lawless men. They don't really keep this law that they preach. So there's that accusation. Now, all that remains then at this point is to ask why Jesus portrays this lawlessness as something on the inside, because that is what he says. Inwardly, you are full of lawlessness. And of course, that's in keeping even with the prior woe about the cup. It's dirty on the inside, it's unclean on the inside. Why does he say that they are men of lawlessness on the inside? Let's stop and pause and think about that for a moment. We might think that Jesus has in mind law-breaking in the form of sinful thoughts and attitudes. That's normally how we think about it. If we were to say someone is lawless on the inside, we would say that their thought life and their attitudes, what's going on in their heart, that's where the law-breaking actually is. And that might be possible. That might very well be what Jesus had in mind. However, Christ might also be thinking simply of how the scribes and the Pharisees have concealed their lawlessness with the appearance of law-keeping. And I'm a little more inclined to view it this way, that what the idea here between the inward lawlessness and the outward beauty is this idea of trying to conceal your sins with all these deeds they do, trying to make themselves look righteous and honorable in the eyes of the people. Even as these men place the burden of law-keeping on others, they seem to uphold the law by teaching it to others, right? All these people, they get their information on the law of Moses from the scribes and the Pharisees, who are very much teachers of this law. Even as these men break oaths and allow others to break oaths, they do so in such a way that seems to uphold the practice of swearing an oath. If you do it just right, your oath matters. And they have all these, traditions about why that matters and how to make it work. So they're still putting forth this appearance of caring about oaths and keeping your oaths, which seems to be in line with the law of Moses, at least at a casual glance, right? If you're not thinking too carefully about it. Even as they neglect the weightier provisions of the law, they do so while giving precise thought to those lighter provisions like tithing, and therefore they seem very obedient. When you see them counting their herbs very carefully about how to tithe from their spice cabinet, it seems like they're keeping the law, even as they're neglecting the weightier provisions of the law. In these ways, the lawlessness of the scribes and the Pharisees is carefully concealed, right? There is lawlessness there. Jesus is absolutely right, but you might not see it very well because what they put forward to you in terms of their public life is all these things that really do look like keeping the law. In that sense, perhaps, they are lawless inwardly. Not necessarily in that we're talking about their thoughts or their attitudes, but just that they cover up their lawless deeds with deeds that appear very beautiful and honorable and righteous. And that's what you see. It's kind of like misdirection. I don't know if you're taking this from the world of stage magic and all that, but when the magician doesn't want you to see what he's really doing, he puts forth all this smoke and light and everything here to distract your attention so that you don't see what he's really doing. Well, with the scribes and the Pharisees, they're kind of doing a magic trick here. They have their lawlessness. Some of it is visible if you know where to look. The problem is you're not looking there because they've misdirected you with all of their fancy traditions and all of their phylacteries and their tassels and their tithing and all these kinds of things. That may be what Christ has in mind when he speaks of their lawlessness as being inward. Not necessarily with their thought life and their attitudes, but just the fact that their lawless deeds are carefully concealed by other deeds which appear righteous. I'm a little more inclined to think that that's what Christ has in mind. It's more in keeping with the stuff he's been saying about them, so I put that forward to you as my suggestion. So much for lawlessness. We have two other specific accusations made by Christ about the scribes and the Pharisees in these two woes. And these are also things that they carry inside of them, using the language given by Jesus here. And these are robbery and self-indulgence. We see these in the fifth woe. If we back up to verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Now, at first, these accusations appear to be mistaken, right? Robbery and self-indulgence as traits of the scribes and the Pharisees. It doesn't really seem to fit at first. Robbery is the theft of someone else's property by use of violence. We actually talked about this not too long ago in one of my other messages, that when you rob somebody, it means you actually attack them in some way and thereby steal their stuff and run away. It's not just ordinary theft or extortion. There is an element of violence here. And certainly the scribes and the Pharisees were not robbers. They didn't run around hitting people over the head with a hammer, stealing their money. They didn't do that kind of thing. And the ESV perhaps senses this, the ESV translation, and translates robbery as greed, which is not a bad translation based on what we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But just know that for here and now, the literal term actually is robbery. And it doesn't seem to fit with what we know about the scribes and the Pharisees. After all, they are trying to convey this outward form of righteousness to distract everybody. Robbery would really get in the way of that. And then we have the accusation of self-indulgence, which also appears mistaken, right? So self-indulgence is when you gratify every desire you have. If you want this, you take this. You want to do this thing now, you do it now. You want to eat this now, you eat it now. You just self-indulgence. It really is the opposite of self-control. A person with self-control manages those desires, knows how to say no to himself. That's self-control. Self-indulgence is the opposite. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees, they do not really practice self-indulgence in the way we normally think of it. They are men of great self-control. These are the men who have taken it upon themselves to fast twice a week, after all. We see this in other places in the Gospels. We know about it from other Jewish writings. So twice a week, every week, these are men who deprive themselves of things like food, where however hungry you are, if you're going to fast, you're not going to gratify yourself. These men have a great amount of discipline in a lot of ways. I'm willing to bet that your average scribe or Pharisee was more disciplined than anyone sitting in this room right now. And I'm certainly willing to say that about myself. So in terms of having some form of self-control, they have that. So these accusations appear to be mistaken, that Jesus isn't really hitting the mark here. However, the illustrations and the wording of Jesus direct us to look for these sins in a form concealed by the appearance of righteousness. Again, we're dealing with, cutting through the fog of misdirection created by the scribes and the Pharisees, where you look at them and say, well, they seem really holy. You got to look through that and see what's really there behind all of that, what's concealed, what's true on the inside. And Jesus says if you look carefully enough on the inside, there is some form of robbery and some form of self-indulgence. Now, I can think of no better example of robbery and self-indulgence among the scribes and the Pharisees than something Matthew has already recorded earlier in his gospel. And I feel like I've come to this passage several times recently because I I think it illustrates the scribes and the Pharisees so well. This is Matthew 15, verses 1 through 6. I want to read this to you, and as I read it to you, be thinking about robbery and self-indulgence. And let's talk about if the scribes and the Pharisees actually display those traits in some way if you look carefully enough. Matthew 15, starting in verse 1. Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." Again, focusing on these, very readily apparent forms of righteousness. These ceremonial washings they do before they eat every meal. So again, the misdirection. We have the misdirection, the outward beauty and the outward righteousness they want you to see. All right, but Jesus answers them. He answered them and said to them, "Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. The scribes and the Pharisees are not the ones who are lawbreakers here, right? They're the heirs of Moses. How dare he accuse them of transgressing the law at this point? Well, let's see what his argument is. "For God has said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, 'Whatever I have that would have helped you has been given to God,' and he is therefore not to honor his father or mother. And by this you have invalidated the word of God for the sake of your tradition." Now let's think about this practice. This is the practice of Korban, as it is called elsewhere. This is the practice of dedicating your belongings to the use of God so that no one else can make use of them. And it seems pretty holy, right? If you were trying to create an outward, external form of righteousness that seemed very honorable, this would be the way to do it. Everything I have has been given to God. It's for his use now. Seems pretty holy, right? Okay, but what's really happening? What's happening, in this world where everything is carefully concealed? What's happening on the inside? Well, what's really happening is a refusal to share your possessions with people who deserve them, being your father and mother, and people who might need them as they get older and unable to take care of themselves. Your father and mother are going to be in need at some point, and you have the ability to help them, but you're not going to do that because you wanted to create this appearance of righteousness by giving all that you had to God, right? So this really is, when you think about it, a form of self-indulgence. They're spending their possessions on what? On their own reputation. Their decision here to dedicate all they have to God really is dedicating it all to their own reputation so that they'll have the esteem of being holy. So they're really spending these things not on their father or their mother, and not even really on the Lord, but on their own reputation as men of holiness. Furthermore, it's also a kind of robbery because guess what? Harm is going to come to somebody because of this. And here especially their mothers and their fathers who are going to be in need and destitute and impoverished because their son gave all he had to God, and now they're going to suffer for it. Is that not the same spirit as a robber has, harming people to get what he wants? The scribes and the Pharisees are doing this. They are practicing a form of robbery and a form of self-indulgence. But most people are not going to see that because of the misdirection, because they've created this appearance, this beauty of this outward righteousness. But if you can see through that, you're going to see what's on the inside, robbery and self-indulgence. So Christ really is correct in these things. He is not mistaken. He is just more insightful than most people were at that time. And he was able to see through the smoke screen that these men had built up around themselves. He was able to see through the reputation and call these men exactly what they were at this time, no matter how hard they tried to conceal those things on the inside. So here at the end of this sermon, I am reminded that so many people, when they read Matthew 23, wonder if Christ is being too hard on the scribes and the Pharisees. And you see this among Christian commentators. You get to this section. Is Jesus being too hard on these men? Oh, I don't know. It seems like he's being too harsh with them. Well, maybe a better use of our energy would be, first of all, self-examination to make sure that our own religion is primarily inward and honest and sincere and not aimed at exalting ourselves while damning others. Perhaps that would be a better use of our energy than trying to plead the case of the scribes and the Pharisees, because even if those men were not as bad as Jesus said, Some people are. Guess what? There are people like this. There are people, surprise, surprise, who actually do put forth a lot of effort to create this appearance as the earnest churchgoer, the God-fearing man or woman, when in reality they are not. And if you look carefully enough, you see that. And you see the ways they try to conceal their own lawlessness by these deeds that appear beautiful, but which really are just a smokescreen. These people do exist. And you know what? It's not so shocking, right, that Jesus would suggest that people in his time and place were also this way. And it's not at all out of place that the scribes and the Pharisees might have been those people, right? As the people who were most apparently holy, they ran the risk of being most likely to be this kind of person, focusing as they did on all these external matters as they were so often doing. So you know what? It's not a misplaced accusation. It's not unheard of. And as you think about these things, rather than wondering if Christ was really on point in these matters, how about trying to make sure you don't become like this kind of person? It is a much more worthwhile use of your time, I think. And to that end, I've spoken to you today about this secret pollution of the scribes and the Pharisees, the secret pollution that any person who is religious might fall into, not just at the point where their whole life is a lie, but to where they are actually corrupting other people through it and bringing on those people some kind of judgment. Because after all, that's what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing. Because of their sins and their influence on the people, they were bringing judgment on their nation. Well, that's what we were talking about today. Let me give you a summary here again just before we close. The fifth woe condemned the scribes and the Pharisees for blindly seeking undeserved honor. This is the one where Christ uses the analogy of the cup. Here they are cleaning the outside of the cup, trying to make themselves look nice and get the praise of men, when in reality they were just sinners through and through. And Jesus uses this analogy of the cups based on really their own laws and traditions about the cleansing of cups and vessels, and using that to talk about them and how shallow their own righteousness actually was. And this was his example of their blindness toward the actual importance of real repentance and true righteousness. The sixth woe condemned the scribes and the Pharisees for destructive hypocrisy. Christ did this by using the practices of the scribes and the Pharisees regarding burial places, graves, and tombs, very much based on the law of Moses, but going further with all this whitewashing. And he said, you know what? You guys are like those whitewashed tombs. You guys spread the most powerful form of uncleanness and corrupt other people by who you are. By creating this outward appearance of righteousness, you're actually flagging yourself as being full of all uncleanness, making the entire city unclean by what they were doing. And then finally, throughout these two woes, Jesus described men who crave the honor of the people more than the law of their God. They wanted to create the appearance of righteousness and gain honor for themselves, when in reality they were full of lawlessness and robbery and self-indulgence. And those are the things, of course, we talked about here at the end and how right those accusations were. Okay, so next time I will teach about the seventh woe in this second warning given by Jesus about the scribes and the Pharisees, but also directed to the scribes and the Pharisees. This is actually going to be the final woe that he addresses to these men. So that is what we will do next time whenever I teach next.